Amara Johnson stood outside the towering glass doors of Sterling Industries, her hand instinctively moving to her still flat stomach as she tried to steady her breathing and summon the courage for what might be the most dangerous job interview of her life. 6 months. It had been 6 months since she'd walked away from Alexander Sterling without explanation, leaving behind the most passionate relationship of her life because she'd finally understood that loving him meant accepting that she would always come second to his empire. 6 months since she discovered she was pregnant with twins and made the hardest decision of her life, to disappear rather than trap him in a family he'd never wanted. Ms. Johnson. The security guard's voice broke through her spiraling thoughts. Mr. Sterling is ready to see you in the penthouse kitchen. Amara nodded, unable to trust her voice as she followed him toward the executive elevator that would take her 40 floors up to face the man she'd never stopped loving, the man who had no idea he was about to hire the mother of his unborn children as his private chef. The elevator climbed silently through the Manhattan skyline, giving Amara precious minutes to rehearse the performance that would either save her future or destroy what was left of her carefully reconstructed life. She'd applied for the position using her maiden name, Johnson, instead of the Sterling she dreamed of becoming. She'd submitted a portfolio that showcased her culinary skills without revealing the personal connection that had taught her exactly how Alexander liked his morning coffee, his preference for Mediterranean flavors, and his weakness for the chocolate soufflé she perfected during their 3 months together. The penthouse kitchen was a chef's fantasy: marble countertops, commercial-grade appliances, and windows that offered a breathtaking view of Central Park. But Amara barely noticed the stunning space because all her attention was focused on the man standing with his back to the elevator, reviewing what appeared to be her resume on his tablet. Alexander Sterling, at 34, was even more commanding than she remembered. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his charcoal suit was tailored to emphasize his athletic build, and everything about his posture radiated the confidence of someone who had built a technology empire worth $8 billion before most people finished paying off their student loans. Ms. Johnson, Alexander said, turning toward her with the polite smile he reserved for business meetings. For a moment, Amara held her breath, waiting for the flash of recognition that would destroy her carefully planned deception. But his expression remained professionally neutral as he extended his hand for a businesslike handshake. "Thank you for coming," Alexander continued. "I understand you're interested in the private chef position." Amara forced herself to breathe normally as she realized that her appearance had changed enough over the past 6 months. Longer hair, different style, and the subtle changes that early pregnancy had brought to her face, that Alexander didn't immediately recognize her. "Yes, Mr. Sterling," Amara replied, proud that her voice remained steady despite the chaos in her chest. "I'm very interested in the opportunity." Alexander gestured toward the kitchen's center island, where her portfolio lay open beside an impressive array of ingredients. "I've reviewed your credentials, and I'm impressed by your training at the Culinary Institute and your experience at Le Bernardin," he said, his tone carrying the efficiency of someone who approached every decision with meticulous analysis. "But I'd like to see your skills in action. Would you be comfortable preparing something that demonstrates your range and creativity? Have you ever had to hide your true identity from someone you loved while pretending to be a stranger? How did you manage the emotional complexity?" The practical test was exactly what Amara had prepared for, but being in the same room with Alexander while carrying his children was overwhelming her carefully maintained composure. Every gesture, every inflection in his voice, every familiar habit was triggering memories of mornings when she'd cooked for him out of love rather than professional necessity. "Of course," Amara said, moving toward the ingredients with the focused energy that always helped her channel emotional chaos into culinary creativity. "Do you have any preferences or dietary restrictions I should consider?" "Surprise me," Alexander replied, settling onto a bar stool where he could observe her work. "I'm curious to see how you approach unfamiliar challenges." If only he knew, Amara thought as she began selecting ingredients for a dish that would showcase her skills while avoiding anything that might trigger the morning sickness that had been plaguing her for weeks. She chose to prepare seared duck breast with a cherry gastrique, accompanied by roasted root vegetables and a delicate herb salad, a combination that was sophisticated enough to impress a billionaire palate but familiar enough that she could execute it flawlessly despite her nervousness. As Amara worked, she was acutely aware of Alexander watching her every movement with the intense focus he brought to evaluating potential investments. She'd forgotten how unsettling his attention could be when it was directed at her with analytical rather than affectionate intent. "You have excellent knife skills," Alexander observed as Amara julienned vegetables with rapid precision. "Where did you develop that level of technique?" "Practice," Amara replied honestly. "I've been cooking since I was 12, and I believe that fundamental skills are the foundation of everything else." "Self-taught initially?" "Yes. My grandmother was an excellent cook, and I learned by watching her prepare meals for our family." The conversation was safely professional, but Amara could feel dangerous territory approaching as Alexander's questions became more personal. "What brought you to New York?" he asked. Amara's hand stilled for just a moment before she resumed her prep work. "Opportunity," she said. "This city has the best restaurants, the most demanding customers, and the greatest potential for career advancement." It wasn't entirely a lie. She had come to New York for opportunity. She'd just found love instead of professional success, and when that love had proved impossible to sustain, she'd stayed in the city because leaving would have felt like admitting complete failure. "And what brought you to private chef work?" Alexander continued. "Most chefs your age are focused on restaurant careers, building their own brands." The question hit closer to her real situation than Alexander could have known. Amara had applied for the private chef position because it offered the stability and discretionary schedule she would need as a single mother, along with the kind of compensation that could support her family without requiring the 80-hour weeks that restaurant careers demanded. "I'm interested in the creative freedom that private work offers," Amara said, plating her dish with the artistic precision that had always impressed Alexander during their relationship. "The opportunity to develop personalized menus, to really understand a client's preferences and create experiences tailored specifically for them." She slid the completed plate across the marble counter, watching Alexander's face as he took his first bite of food she'd prepared with hands that had once traced the contours of his body, that had learned every detail of his preferences through intimacy rather than professional observation. Alexander's expression shifted as he tasted the duck, and for a moment, Amara saw a flicker of something that might have been recognition, not of her face, but of her culinary style, the particular way she balanced flavors that had made their meals together memorable. "This is exceptional," Alexander said, taking another bite with obvious appreciation. "The flavor profile is complex but perfectly balanced. You have a gift for this." The praise warmed Amara in ways that went far beyond professional validation. She'd cooked for Alexander Sterling before, and his appreciation had always been deeply personal. Hearing that same appreciation expressed as professional respect felt like a bittersweet echo of everything she'd lost. "Thank you," Amara said. "I'm glad you enjoyed it." Alexander finished the entire plate, then set down his fork and looked at her with the kind of direct attention that had always made Amara feel like she was the most important thing in his world. "Ms. Johnson," he said, "I'd like to offer you the position." 8 months before Amara Johnson stood in Alexander Sterling's penthouse kitchen preparing the meal that would secure her employment as his private chef, she had been Amara Mitchell, the woman he introduced to business associates as someone special, but never quite elevated to the status of serious girlfriend. Their relationship had begun at Le Bernardin, where Amara was working as a sous chef and Alexander was hosting a dinner for potential investors in his latest technology venture. She'd been called out from the kitchen to explain the preparation of a particularly complex seafood course, and their conversation had extended far beyond the professional explanation he'd requested. "Most people ask about ingredients and cooking times," Amara had said, impressed by Alexander's sophisticated questions about flavor combinations and technique. "You're asking about the philosophy behind the dish." "I'm interested in understanding how creativity translates into results," Alexander had replied. "Whether that's in cuisine, technology, or any other field where innovation matters." The conversation had led to coffee the next day, then dinner the following week, then 3 months of the most intense and passionate relationship of Amara's life. Alexander Sterling was unlike anyone she'd ever dated. His intelligence was intimidating, his ambition was boundless, and his success was so comprehensive that it seemed to bend reality around his desires. When Alexander wanted something, whether a business deal, a reservation at an impossible-to-book restaurant, or time with Amara despite his insane schedule, he found ways to make it happen through sheer force of will and unlimited resources. Being with Alexander had felt like stepping into a fairy tale where every limitation she'd ever accepted about her life suddenly became negotiable. He'd arranged for her to stage at world-renowned restaurants during his business trips to Paris and Tokyo. He'd introduced her to celebrity chefs who'd become mentors and collaborators. He talked seriously about funding her own restaurant, making her dreams achievable through his connections and capital. But Alexander's world had also been overwhelming in ways that Amara had struggled to navigate. The media attention had been intense and often cruel. Paparazzi had photographed them at restaurants, speculating about Amara's background and whether she was good enough for one of New York's most eligible bachelors. Society bloggers had dissected her appearance, her education, and her career, often concluding that she was a temporary distraction rather than a serious partner. "Don't read that garbage," Alexander had advised when Amara showed him particularly vicious comments about their relationship. "Those people don't matter. What matters is what we have together." But what they had together had always felt temporary to Amara, despite Alexander's assurances. She was granted access to his world, but never quite membership in it. She attended his business dinners but was introduced as Amara, a talented chef, rather than as his girlfriend. She stayed at his penthouse but kept her own apartment because their arrangement never felt permanent enough to justify giving up her independence. Most tellingly, Alexander had never discussed their future in terms that included marriage, children, or the kind of life building that Amara had begun to crave as their relationship deepened. When you love someone whose world feels too big for you to belong in permanently, how do you distinguish between normal relationship uncertainty and fundamental incompatibility? The breaking point had come during what should have been the happiest moment of their relationship. Alexander had been selected to receive the Technology Innovation Award from the Global Economic Forum, a recognition that would cement his reputation as one of the most influential entrepreneurs of his generation. The award ceremony was being held in Davos, and Alexander had invited Amara to accompany him to what he described as the most important night of my career. Amara had been thrilled to share such a significant milestone with him, interpreting the invitation as evidence that their relationship had evolved into something more serious than either of them had previously acknowledged. The ceremony itself had been magnificent. Alexander's acceptance speech had been brilliant, articulating a vision for technology's role in solving global problems that had earned him a standing ovation from world leaders and industry titans. Amara had watched from the audience with pride and love, feeling genuinely honored to witness his moment of triumph. But the celebration afterward had revealed the fundamental disconnect in how they viewed their relationship and their future together. "This is it," Alexander had said during the private dinner that followed the ceremony. "This recognition opens doors to opportunities I've been working toward for my entire career. The next 5 years are going to be crucial for establishing the company's global presence." He'd been energized by success, talking rapidly about expansion plans, international partnerships, and strategic acquisitions that would require constant travel and total focus. "I want you to be part of this," Alexander had continued, reaching across the table to take Amara's hand. "I want you with me as we build something that will change the world." Amara had felt her heart soar with hope, interpreting his words as a proposal for their relationship to evolve into a true partnership. "What does that look like?" she'd asked, imagining conversations about marriage, family, and building a life together that balanced his ambitions with their personal happiness. "Well," Alexander had said, "I'll need someone who can manage my personal needs while I focus on business development. Someone who understands my preferences, who can handle the social aspects of my schedule, who can create the kind of home environment that supports high-performance professional work." As he continued talking, Amara had realized with growing horror that Alexander wasn't proposing marriage. He was proposing that she become a permanent employee disguised as a girlfriend. "You want me to be your personal assistant," she'd said quietly. "I want you to be my partner," Alexander had corrected. "But yes, in a practical sense, I need someone who can handle the lifestyle management that success at this level requires." He'd seemed genuinely confused by her lack of enthusiasm for what he considered a generous offer. "Amara, I'm inviting you to share in building an empire. Most people would consider that an incredible opportunity." But Amara had finally understood that Alexander's vision of their future included her as a supporting player in his success story, not as an equal partner in a shared life. "And what about my career?" she'd asked. "What about my dreams of opening my own restaurant?" "Those dreams are still possible," Alexander had said. "But they'll have to be compatible with my schedule and responsibilities. Maybe something smaller scale, more flexible." The suggestion that she should scale down her ambitions to accommodate his had been the moment Amara realized that Alexander loved her, but not enough to envision a life where her success was as important as his own. She'd returned to New York knowing that their relationship was over, even though it had taken her 2 more weeks to find the courage to end it. The conversation that had ended their relationship had been brief and devastating. "I can't be what you need," Amara had told him. "And you can't be what I need either." "What do you need?" Alexander had asked, genuinely puzzled by her decision to leave. "I need someone who sees me as an equal partner, not as a lifestyle manager. I need someone who wants to build something together, not someone who wants me to help them build their dream while putting mine aside." Alexander had argued, negotiated, and tried to convince her that her perspective was wrong, but Amara had held firm in her decision. 3 weeks after leaving Alexander, Amara had discovered she was pregnant with twins. The pregnancy had been unplanned but not unwelcome, until she'd realized that telling Alexander would trap them both in exactly the kind of unequal relationship she'd been trying to escape. If Alexander learned about the pregnancy, he would insist on marriage out of duty rather than love. He would provide financial support but expect her to organize her life around his needs. He would love their children but raise them to believe that success was more important than happiness, achievement more valuable than relationships. So Amara had made the hardest decision of her life. She disappeared. She'd moved to a different neighborhood, changed her phone number, and used her savings to enroll in culinary school under her maiden name while her pregnancy progressed. For 6 months, she'd managed to avoid any contact with Alexander's world while building the skills and credentials she would need to support her children as a single mother. But now her savings were exhausted, her medical bills were mounting, and she needed steady employment with health insurance before the babies arrived. The private chef position with Alexander Sterling was the best-paying job she'd been offered, and the bitter irony wasn't lost on her that the man who'd never wanted to share his life with her might now unknowingly provide the stability she needed to build a life without him. The first humiliation came 3 weeks into Amara's employment when Alexander hosted a dinner party for potential investors, and she overheard him describing his dating life to guests who assumed his private chef was just another piece of expensive domestic help. Amara was in the kitchen putting finishing touches on the appetizer course when the conversation in the adjacent dining room became clearly audible through the service window. She'd been carefully avoiding any situation that might trigger Alexander's memory of their relationship, but she couldn't avoid overhearing discussions that took place during her work hours. "Alexander, you've been suspiciously absent from the social scene lately," said Victoria Ashworth, a prominent socialite whose family owned a major investment firm. "Are you seeing anyone seriously?" Amara's hand stilled on the plates she was arranging as she waited for Alexander's response. "Not currently," Alexander replied with a casual tone that had always made Amara feel like their relationship had been less significant to him than it had been to her. "I've been focused on business development. Romance requires more time and attention than I can spare right now." "That's unfortunate," said another guest. "A man in your position should have someone appropriate to accompany him to important events." Appropriate was the word that had always made Amara feel like she'd been auditioning for a role rather than building a relationship. She'd never been quite appropriate enough, not wealthy enough, not connected enough, not willing enough to subvert her own ambitions to support his. "I'm sure when the right opportunity presents itself, I'll pursue it," Alexander continued. "But I'm not interested in casual relationships that don't serve my long-term goals." The clinical way he discussed romance, as if love were a strategic acquisition rather than an emotional connection, reminded Amara why she'd been right to leave him, even as it stung to hear herself dismissed as a failed opportunity. "What about that chef you were seeing last year?" Victoria asked with a casual cruelty that wealthy people often displayed toward those they considered beneath their social status. "The one from that restaurant? What was her name?" Amara's breath caught as she realized Alexander was about to discuss their relationship with people who would dissect it as entertainment. "Amara," Alexander said, and the sound of her name in his voice sent an involuntary shiver through her body. "That situation didn't work out." "She wasn't suitable for your lifestyle," Victoria observed with satisfaction. "I could have told you that from the beginning. Working-class girls always have unrealistic expectations about relationships with men in your position." The casual dismissal of Amara's worth based on her background was exactly the kind of attitude that had made her feel like an outsider in Alexander's world, even when he'd been defending her against similar comments. It wasn't about class, Alexander said, and Amara found herself leaning closer to the service window to hear his perspective on their breakup. Amara is, an incredibly talented chef. Brilliant, actually. The correction from past to present tense caught Amara's attention. Did Alexander still think about her in present terms? But she had very specific ideas about what she wanted from life, Alexander continued, and those ideas weren't compatible with what I could offer. The explanation was technically accurate, but missed the emotional truth that had driven their incompatibility. Alexander was describing their breakup as a business negotiation that had failed to reach mutually acceptable terms, rather than acknowledging that he'd been unwilling to envision a relationship where her dreams mattered as much as his. You offered her access to a lifestyle most people can only dream of, said James Morrison, another investor. What more could she possibly have wanted? When you hear someone you loved reduce your relationship to a failed transaction, how do you maintain your dignity while your heart breaks all over again? That's when Alexander said something that made Amara grip the edge of the prep counter to steady herself. She wanted me to choose her over my career, Alexander said, his voice carrying a note of lingering confusion and hurt. She wanted guarantees about our future that I wasn't ready to make. The mischaracterization of her needs was so profound that Amara felt tears threatening. She'd never asked Alexander to choose her over his career. She'd asked him to envision a future where both their careers mattered. She'd never demanded guarantees. She'd asked for evidence that he saw her as an equal partner rather than a supporting player. Some women don't understand the sacrifices that success requires, Victoria said with the authority of someone who'd married wealth rather than earned it. They want fairy tale romance when what men like you need is practical partnership. Perhaps, Alexander replied, though his voice carried uncertainty rather than agreement. You're better off without her, James added. When you do settle down, it should be with someone who understands your world, someone who can enhance your position rather than limiting it. Amara had heard enough. She needed to get out of the kitchen before the conversation continued in directions that would completely destroy her carefully maintained professional composure. But as she moved toward the hallway that led to the service elevator, she heard Alexander say something that stopped her cold. Actually, Alexander said, his voice growing thoughtful, I think about her more than I probably should. Sometimes I wonder if I made a mistake. The admission hit Amara like a physical blow, flooding her with emotions she'd spent 6 months trying to suppress. You wonder if you made a mistake. Victoria's voice carried surprise and disapproval. Alexander, that kind of thinking isn't productive. You made the right choice for your career and your future. Maybe, Alexander said, but I've never found anyone else who made me feel the way she did. No one else has ever challenged me the way she did, or made me want to be better than I thought I was capable of being. The words were everything Amara had hoped to hear during their relationship, but hearing them now, while she was carrying his children and hiding in his kitchen, felt like cruel irony. That's when she made a decision that would begin the unraveling of her carefully constructed deception. Instead of leaving through the service elevator, Amara returned to the kitchen and began preparing the next course with more energy and creativity than any previous dish she prepared for Alexander. If he was going to talk about her as a lost opportunity, she was going to remind him, without revealing her identity, of exactly what kind of culinary artist he'd let slip away. She prepared a dish that had been one of his favorites during their relationship, pan-seared halibut with a saffron cream sauce, accompanied by roasted fennel and microgreens. But she elevated it beyond anything she'd made for him before, incorporating techniques she'd learned during her recent culinary training and adding subtle flavor combinations that would showcase her growth as a chef. When she delivered the course to the dining room, Amara made sure to present it to Alexander personally, meeting his eyes with professional confidence while internally daring him to recognize the connection between his current chef and the woman he'd been discussing. Alexander took one bite of the halibut, and his expression changed completely. He looked up at Amara with something approaching recognition, though not quite comprehension. This is... Alexander paused, searching for words. This is extraordinary. The flavor profile is exactly... How did you know to prepare it this way? Intuition, Amara replied calmly, meeting his confused gaze with steady professionalism. I try to understand my clients' preferences and create dishes that will resonate with them personally. As she returned to the kitchen, Amara realized that her small act of defiance had accomplished exactly what she'd intended. Alexander was now questioning whether there was more to his new chef than he'd initially understood. But she'd also opened a door that might lead to discoveries she wasn't prepared to handle, especially as her pregnancy became more difficult to hide and her emotions became harder to control. The escalation began 2 weeks later when Amara's morning sickness became so severe that she collapsed in Alexander's kitchen during preparation for an important business breakfast, leading to the first twist that would begin to unravel her carefully maintained secret. Amara had been fighting nausea for an hour while preparing eggs Benedict for Alexander and 3 Japanese investors who were considering a major partnership with Sterling Industries. The smell of hollandaise sauce, normally one of her favorite preparations, was triggering waves of sickness that she was barely managing to control through sheer willpower. She'd been stirring the sauce when a particularly intense wave of nausea combined with dizziness from not eating properly in days caused her to grab the edge of the stove for support. The sudden movement knocked over a pot of boiling water, sending scalding liquid across the marble floor and creating enough noise to alert Alexander, who had been reviewing contracts in the adjacent dining room. "What happened?" Alexander called, appearing in the kitchen doorway just as Amara sank to her knees, overwhelmed by nausea and the realization that she'd just destroyed the carefully timed breakfast service. "I'm sorry," Amara gasped, trying to stand despite the dizziness. "I knocked over the pot. I can clean it up and restart the sauce." "Forget the sauce," Alexander said, moving toward her with concern that was purely human rather than professional. "Are you hurt? Did the water burn you?" The unexpected gentleness in his voice, the same tone he'd used during their relationship when she'd been sick or stressed, brought tears to Amara's eyes that had nothing to do with physical pain. "I'm fine," she lied, attempting to get to her feet but swaying enough that Alexander instinctively reached out to steady her. The moment his hands touched her arms, Amara felt the familiar electricity that had always existed between them, the physical connection that had made their relationship so intense and their breakup so devastating. But what made the situation dangerous was that Alexander was now close enough to see details he'd missed during their previous professional interactions. The subtle changes pregnancy had brought to her face, the way she was breathing carefully to manage nausea, and something else that she couldn't quite identify in his expression. "Ms. Johnson," Alexander said slowly, his voice carrying a note of confusion, "have we met before? Outside of your employment here?" The question hit Amara like a thunderbolt. She'd been so focused on hiding her pregnancy that she hadn't realized her collapse had brought them into the kind of close contact that might trigger his memory of their relationship. "I don't think so," Amara replied, forcing herself to meet his eyes despite the panic in her chest. "Perhaps you saw me at Le Bernardin when you dined there? I worked in that kitchen for 2 years. It was a plausible explanation that might account for any sense of familiarity Alexander was experiencing without revealing their personal connection. But Alexander wasn't satisfied with her answer. He was studying her face with the intense focus he brought to analyzing complex business problems, and Amara could see recognition building in his expression. "Your voice," Alexander said thoughtfully. "There's something about your voice that's very familiar." Before Amara could respond, the kitchen timer chimed, reminding her that she had 3 Japanese investors waiting for breakfast and a professional reputation to maintain regardless of her personal crisis. "Mr. Sterling," she said, forcing herself to step away from his touch and return to professional mode, "I need to restart the breakfast service. Your guests are waiting." "Cancel the meeting," Alexander said immediately. "You're clearly not well enough to work." "I can't let you cancel an important business meeting because I knocked over a pot," Amara protested, though the concern in his voice was making it harder to maintain her emotional distance. "Actually," Alexander said, "you can and you will. I'm calling Dr. Matthews to examine you." The mention of a doctor sent panic through Amara's system. A medical examination would immediately reveal her pregnancy, destroying her secret and potentially her employment. "That's not necessary," Amara said quickly. "I just haven't been eating regularly. Low blood sugar, probably. I'll be fine with some food and rest." But Alexander was already reaching for his phone, and Amara realized she needed to make a choice: accept medical attention that would expose her pregnancy, or find a way to convince him that she was fine without seeming to refuse reasonable care. When protecting your secret requires refusing help you desperately need, how do you balance self-preservation with survival? That's when the first twist occurred. something that would change the entire dynamic of their relationship and force Amara to confront the impossibility of maintaining her deception much longer. Alexander's assistant Jennifer appeared in the kitchen doorway, her expression urgent enough to interrupt even a medical emergency. "Mr. Sterling," Jennifer said, "I'm sorry to interrupt, but I have Detective Morrison on the phone. He says it's urgent and relates to the investigation we discussed last month." Alexander's attention shifted immediately from Amara to Jennifer, his expression becoming serious in ways that suggested this wasn't routine business. "What investigation?" Amara asked, the journalist instinct that had always made her curious about Alexander's life overriding her need to remain professionally distant. "It's complicated," Alexander said, hesitating in a way that was unusual for someone who typically made decisions with confident efficiency. "Mr. Sterling," Jennifer pressed, "Detective Morrison says they've identified the woman from the surveillance footage. The one who's been following you." The information hit the room like a bomb. Someone had been following Alexander? What kind of surveillance footage was Jennifer discussing? Following him? Amara repeated, forgetting that her concern was revealing more personal interest than a professional employee should display. Alexander looked at Amara with an expression that mixed surprise with something approaching suspicion. "Ms. Johnson," he said slowly, "why do you seem so concerned about my personal security? That's not typically within a chef's area of professional interest." The question revealed that Amara's emotional response had been too strong, too personal for someone who was supposed to be merely an employee. I want to make sure the household is safe," Amara said weakly, realizing that her cover was beginning to crack under pressure. "Mr. Sterling," Jennifer interrupted again, "Detective Morrison really needs to speak with you immediately. And he's asking if you've had any contact with Amara Mitchell in the past 6 months. The mention of her real name sent shockwaves through Amara's system. The police were looking for Amara Mitchell in connection with surveillance of Alexander Sterling. But why? What did they think she'd done? Alexander's head snapped toward Amara, his expression cycling rapidly through confusion, recognition, and something approaching anger. "Amara Mitchell," he repeated slowly, staring at her face as pieces of a puzzle finally clicked into place. "Your real name is Amara Mitchell." The game was over. 6 weeks of careful deception had just collapsed in 30 seconds, and Amara found herself face to face with the man she'd been hiding from while carrying his children. "Alexander," she said quietly, abandoning the professional pretense that was no longer sustainable, "I can explain." "Can you?" Alexander's voice carried the cold edge that had always emerged when he felt betrayed or manipulated. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've been lying to me for weeks while working in my home under false pretenses." He turned to Jennifer with instructions that made Amara's blood run cold. "Tell Detective Morrison that I've found Amara Mitchell. She's been living in my penthouse for 6 weeks as my private chef." As Jennifer left to make the call, Alexander turned back to Amara with an expression that mixed hurt, anger, and confusion. "I want answers," he said. "All of them. Starting with why you disappeared 6 months ago, why you're using a false name, and why the police think you've been stalking me." Amara realized that her pregnancy secret was about to become the least of her problems. She was about to discover that someone had been impersonating her, that her disappearance had triggered a police investigation, and that Alexander had spent 6 months believing she'd been harassing him. The truth was going to be far more complicated than either of them had imagined. The emotional breakthrough that would transform both Amara's understanding of Alexander's behavior and his comprehension of her disappearance came when Detective Morrison arrived with evidence that revealed the truth behind 6 months of deception, manipulation, and heartbreak. "Mr. Sterling, Ms. Mitchell," Detective Morrison said, settling into the penthouse living room with a thick file that would change everything they thought they knew about their separation. "I think it's time we cleared up some serious misconceptions that have been affecting both of your lives." Amara sat across from Alexander, acutely aware that her secret pregnancy was now the least shocking revelation they were about to confront. The hostility in Alexander's expression since learning her real identity had been crushing, but she could see confusion beginning to temper his anger as Detective Morrison prepared to present evidence. "Ms. Mitchell," Detective Morrison began, 6 months ago, you disappeared without explanation from Mr. Sterling's life. At the same time, Mr. Sterling began receiving communications that appeared to be from you, emails, text messages, and phone calls that escalated from romantic to obsessive to threatening. Amara felt the world tilt as she processed what Detective Morrison was telling her. "I never sent Alexander any communications after I left. I haven't contacted him at all." "We know that now," Detective Morrison replied. "But at the time, the messages appeared to be coming from your email accounts and phone number. They included personal details about your relationship that only you would have known." He opened his file and showed them printed copies of messages that made Amara's blood run cold. "These emails started 2 weeks after you disappeared," Detective Morrison continued. "They began with expressions of regret about leaving, then progressed to demands for reconciliation, and finally escalated to threats about what would happen if Mr. Sterling moved on with someone else." Alexander was staring at the evidence with an expression of growing realization and horror. "You thought I sent these?" Amara asked, reading messages that were written in a twisted version of her voice, expressing obsessions and threats that she'd never felt or considered. "The technical evidence suggested they were coming from your accounts," Detective Morrison explained. "The personal details were accurate. Mr. Sterling had no reason to believe you weren't the sender." Alexander looked at Amara with an expression that was transforming from anger to understanding and guilt. "Amara," he said quietly, "I thought, for 6 months, I believed you'd been stalking me, that you'd left because you were unstable, that everything about our relationship had been a lie." The revelation hit Amara like a physical blow. Alexander hadn't spent 6 months dismissing their relationship as unimportant. He'd spent 6 months believing she transformed from the woman he'd loved into someone who was harassing and threatening him. "But who?" Amara asked, her voice breaking as she understood the scope of what had been done to both of them. "Who had access to my personal information? Who knew enough about our relationship to create convincing fake messages?" Detective Morrison pulled out another set of documents that would provide the answer neither of them had expected. "Victoria Ashworth," he said, showing them surveillance photos of a woman Amara recognized as one of Alexander's social circle. "She hired a private investigator to gather information about your relationship, then used that information to create fake communications that would make Mr. Sterling believe you were stalking him." "Victoria." Alexander's voice carried shock and betrayal. "Why would Victoria do that?" "According to the investigator we arrested," Detective Morrison continued, "Ms. Ashworth has been obsessed with you for years. When you began dating Ms. Mitchell, she became convinced that eliminating her would clear the path for her own romantic relationship with you." Amara remembered Victoria from the dinner party where she'd overheard the conversation about Alexander's dating life, the woman who dismissed Amara as not suitable and encouraged Alexander to find someone appropriate for his lifestyle. "She's been manipulating both of you," Detective Morrison said, "making Ms. Mitchell believe she had to disappear to protect Mr. Sterling from an unwanted relationship, while making Mr. Sterling believe Ms. Mitchell had become dangerously obsessed with him. When you discover that your deepest pain was caused by someone else's manipulation rather than the person you thought had hurt you, how do you process the redirection of years of anger and grief?" Alexander stood up and walked to the window overlooking Central Park, his shoulders carrying the weight of understanding how thoroughly he'd been deceived. "Amara," he said without turning around, "you left because you thought I didn't value you enough to build a real future together." "Yes," Amara replied honestly. "And I let you go because I thought you wanted things I wasn't ready to give, and then I believed you become someone who was trying to destroy my life when I didn't respond to your attempts at reconciliation." "Yes." Alexander turned back to face her, his expression carrying pain, regret, and something that looked like hope. "We were both wrong," he said. "We were both manipulated into believing the worst about each other and ourselves." Detective Morrison cleared his throat, indicating he had more information to share. "There's something else," he said. "Ms. Ashworth's manipulation didn't end with fake communications. She's been actively sabotaging Mr. Sterling's attempts to find Ms. Mitchell over the past 6 months." "What do you mean?" Alexander asked. "Mr. Sterling, you hired 3 different private investigators to locate Ms. Mitchell," Detective Morrison explained. "Ms. Ashworth used her social connections to identify those investigators and provided them with false information that sent them searching in wrong directions." Alexander's face went white as he processed this information. "I've been looking for you," he told Amara. "I've been trying to find you for months, but every lead turned into a dead end. "You were looking for me?" Amara's voice was barely a whisper. "Every day," Alexander said, his voice breaking with emotion. "Even when I believed you were stalking me, part of me couldn't accept that the woman I'd fallen in love with had become someone I needed to fear." The admission hung between them like a bridge across 6 months of pain and misunderstanding. "Alexander," Amara said, "there's something I need to tell you. Something about why I really left, and why I've been hiding from you." She took a deep breath, preparing to reveal the secret that would change both their lives forever. "I'm pregnant," she said. "I'm carrying twins, and they're yours." The silence in the room was absolute. Alexander stared at her with an expression that cycled through shock, comprehension, and an emotion so intense that Amara couldn't identify it. "Pregnant," he repeated slowly. "Twins." "I found out 3 weeks after I left you," Amara continued, the words pouring out after months of secrecy. "I didn't tell you because I was afraid you'd marry me out of obligation rather than love. I was afraid you'd see the babies as constraints on your career rather than blessings in your life." Alexander sank back into his chair, overwhelmed by revelations that were reshaping his understanding of everything that had happened between them. "You've been carrying my children for 6 months," he said, "and facing pregnancy alone because you thought I wouldn't want to be a father." "I thought you'd see them as complications," Amara admitted. "Problems to be managed rather than lives to be celebrated." Detective Morrison stood up, recognizing that his official business was complete and the conversation needed to become personal. "I'll leave you two to discuss the rest privately," he said. "Ms. Ashworth is in custody, and you'll both need to provide statements for the prosecution. But the immediate threat to both of you has been eliminated." After Detective Morrison left, Amara and Alexander sat in silence, processing 6 months of deception, manipulation, and missed opportunities for truth and reconciliation. "Amara," Alexander said finally, "I want you to know that finding out about the pregnancy changes everything for me, but not in the way you feared." He moved closer to her, close enough that she could see the sincerity and love in his expression. "It changes everything because it makes me realize how much of my life I've been willing to sacrifice for success that means nothing without people to share it with." As Alexander reached for her hand, Amara understood that they were about to begin the conversation that would determine whether their love was strong enough to survive deception, manipulation, and the kind of honest communication they should have had 6 months earlier. The showdown that would determine the future of Amara and Alexander's relationship came when he made a series of decisions that revealed the true depth of his transformation and his willingness to use his power not for business conquest, but for protecting the family he'd never known he wanted. "Amara," Alexander said, moving to kneel beside her chair so they were at eye level, "before we talk about us, I need you to understand something about what these past 6 months have taught me." His proximity was overwhelming, the familiar scent of his cologne, the intensity of his focus, and the gentleness in his voice that she'd thought she'd never hear again. "When I thought I'd lost you to another man, or to your own changing feelings, I was devastated, but I could accept it," Alexander continued. "When I thought I'd lost you because you become someone who wanted to hurt me, I was heartbroken in ways I'd never experienced." He paused, gathering his thoughts with the same careful precision he brought to important business negotiations. "But when I realized I'd lost you because I'd failed to convince you that you were more important to me than my career, I understood that I'd made the biggest mistake of my life." Amara felt tears threatening as she heard words she'd dreamed of hearing during their relationship but had never thought possible. "Alexander," she said, "I need you to understand why I couldn't tell you about the pregnancy. I need you to understand that it wasn't about not trusting you, it was about not wanting to trap either of us in a relationship based on obligation rather than choice." "I know," Alexander replied. "And I need you to understand that discovering I'm going to be a father isn't trapping me, it's giving me something I didn't even realize I wanted more than anything else in the world." He reached for her hands, holding them with the reverence usually reserved for priceless artifacts. "Amara, I've spent 6 months searching for you because I realized that every achievement, every success, every moment of triumph in my life felt empty without you there to share it." The words were beautiful, but Amara needed more than declarations. She needed evidence that Alexander had truly changed his understanding of what mattered most in life. "What about your 5-year plan?" she asked. "What about the global expansion that requires total focus and constant travel? What about building an empire?" Alexander's answer revealed the transformation that would prove his love was stronger than his ambition. "I'm restructuring everything," he said with the quiet confidence of someone who had made peace with a difficult decision. "I'm promoting Jennifer to Chief Operating Officer and transitioning to a chairman role that will allow me to focus on strategy rather than daily operations." Amara stared at him with shock. Alexander's hands-on control of Sterling Industries had been central to his identity since she'd known him. "You're stepping back from running your company?" "I'm stepping forward into running my life," Alexander corrected. "The company will be more successful with distributed leadership and clearer delegation. And I will be more successful as a human being if I prioritize relationships over revenue." But Alexander wasn't finished demonstrating the scope of his transformation. "Furthermore," he continued, "I've already spoken with my attorney about establishing a trust fund for our children's education and future security. But more importantly, I've spoken with my real estate agent about finding a home where we can raise a family." "A home?" Amara repeated, confused about why he would need to find a different living space. "This penthouse is perfect for a bachelor focused on business," Alexander explained. "But it's not appropriate for raising children. I want a house with a yard, in a neighborhood with good schools, where our kids can have normal childhoods." The practical consideration of their children's needs over his own preferences revealed a depth of commitment that Amara had never expected. When someone proves they've changed not through words, but through concrete actions that sacrifice their own comfort for your family's well-being, how do you process the reality that love can inspire transformation? "Alexander," Amara said, "these are huge changes. Are you sure you're not just responding emotionally to discovering the pregnancy? Are you sure you won't regret giving up so much of what you've worked for?" Alexander's answer demonstrated that his decision was based on months of reflection rather than impulsive reaction to current circumstances. "Amara, I started making these changes 3 months ago, when I realized that finding you was more important to me than any business deal I'd ever pursued," he said. "The pregnancy makes them more urgent, but it doesn't make them more necessary." He pulled out his phone and showed her emails and documents that proved his commitment was genuine and long-standing. "I've been working with a business consultant to restructure Sterling Industries for the past 2 months," Alexander continued. "I've been house hunting in Westchester for 6 weeks. I've been preparing to change my life because I hoped that when I found you, I could prove that I'd learned what really mattered." Amara was overwhelmed by evidence that Alexander had been transforming his life in preparation for a reunion he'd hoped for but couldn't guarantee. But the most powerful demonstration of his changed priorities came when his phone rang with what was clearly an urgent business call, and he immediately declined it without even checking who was calling. "Aren't you going to answer that?" Amara asked, remembering how Alexander had never been able to ignore business communications during their relationship. "No," Alexander said simply. "I'm talking to my family. Everything else can wait." The casual way he referred to Amara and their unborn children as his family, and his willingness to prioritize their conversation over business demands, proved his transformation was complete and genuine. "Alexander," Amara said, "if we're going to make this work, if we're going to build a real relationship and raise these children together, I need to know that you see me as an equal partner, not as someone whose dreams are secondary to yours." "Amara," Alexander replied, "I want to invest in your restaurant. Not as a patron or a benefactor, but as a partner who believes in your talent and wants to help you build something extraordinary." The offer was so unexpected that Amara couldn't process it immediately. "You want to fund my restaurant?" "I want to be your business partner in the same way I want to be your life partner," Alexander clarified. "Equal investment, equal decision-making, equal commitment to making your dreams as successful as mine have been." He stood up and walked to his desk, returning with a folder that contained documents that would change Amara's understanding of what their future could look like. "I've been working with commercial real estate agents to identify potential restaurant locations," Alexander said, showing her property listings and financial projections. "I've consulted with restaurant industry experts about market opportunities and operational requirements." The level of research and planning revealed that Alexander had been seriously considering Amara's professional goals even when he didn't know if he'd ever see her again. "But most importantly," Alexander continued, "I've structured the investment as a true partnership where you maintain creative control and operational authority. I want to support your vision, not control it." As Amara reviewed documents that outlined a business relationship based on mutual respect and shared success, she realized that Alexander had learned not just to value her dreams, but to create structures that would protect her autonomy while providing resources for achievement. "There's one more thing," Alexander said, reaching into his jacket pocket to pull out a small velvet box that made Amara's heart stop. "Alexander," she whispered, understanding what was happening but not quite believing it. "Amara Mitchell," he said, opening the box to reveal a ring that was beautiful but not ostentatious, elegant but not overwhelming. "Will you marry me? Not because you're carrying my children, but because you're the woman I want to spend my life learning to love better every day." The proposal was everything Amara had dreamed of during their relationship, a request for partnership rather than a business arrangement, a commitment to growth rather than a demand for perfection. "Will you marry me and build a life where both our dreams matter, where our children grow up understanding that love means supporting each other's highest aspirations?" As Amara looked at the ring, at Alexander's hopeful expression, and at the evidence of his transformation spread across the coffee table, she understood that they were being offered a second chance to build the relationship they should have created the first time. "Yes," she said, her voice strong with certainty and joy. "Yes, I'll marry you." As Alexander slipped the ring onto her finger and kissed her with 6 months of separation and love behind it, Amara understood that sometimes the greatest power isn't the ability to control others, it's the ability to transform yourself for love. The climactic reversal that would complete Amara and Alexander's transformation from broken lovers to united family came 6 months later, when their twins were born and Amara discovered that Alexander's commitment to change had been even more comprehensive than she'd imagined. "They're perfect," Alexander whispered, cradling his daughter Sophia while Amara held their son Marcus in the private room at Mount Sinai Hospital. "They're absolutely perfect." The twins had arrived 2 weeks early, healthy and beautiful, with Sophia inheriting Amara's delicate features and Marcus showing signs of Alexander's stubborn determination even at 3 days old. "Have you seen the gift Alexander arranged for your recovery?" asked Dr. Sarah Martinez, Amara's obstetrician, as she completed the final medical checks that would allow the family to go home. "What gift?" Amara asked, looking at Alexander with curiosity and suspicion. During their engagement, she'd learned that Alexander's expressions of love often involved surprises that were thoughtful but overwhelming in their scope. "I may have arranged for a few conveniences to make your transition home easier," Alexander said with a modest tone that usually preceded revelations of extraordinary generosity. Dr. Martinez smiled as she gathered her medical supplies. "Alexander has hired a team of postpartum specialists, pediatric nurses, and nutritionists to support you for the first 3 months. Plus, he's arranged for meal delivery from 5 different restaurants, so you never have to worry about cooking while you're recovering." The level of care Alexander had arranged was typical of his approach to problem-solving: comprehensive, expertly managed, and designed to eliminate any possible source of stress or difficulty. "Alexander," Amara said, "that's incredibly generous, but I hope you know that I don't need to be treated like I'm helpless." "I know you don't need it," Alexander replied, carefully transferring Sophia to her bassinet. "But I want you to have support so you can focus on enjoying our children instead of worrying about logistics." It was exactly the kind of distinction that proved Alexander had learned the difference between providing support and assuming control. But the most meaningful surprise came when they arrived home to discover that Alexander had transformed their Westchester house into something that honored both their dreams. "Alexander," Amara breathed, walking into what had previously been a formal dining room, "what is this?" The space had been converted into a professional-grade test kitchen, complete with commercial appliances, recipe development stations, and everything Amara would need to create and refine menus for the restaurant they were planning to open. "Your laboratory," Alexander said, clearly pleased with her amazed reaction. "I thought you might want to experiment with recipes during your maternity leave, when you have time to be creative without the pressure of service." But the kitchen was just the beginning of Alexander's vision for their shared future. "There's more," he said, leading her to the adjacent room that had been transformed into a comfortable office space with video conferencing equipment, design software, and architectural plans covering the walls. "This is where we'll plan the restaurant," Alexander explained, "but it's also where I'll be working most days. I've moved my primary office home so I can be present for feedings, diaper changes, and all the moments I don't want to miss." When someone restructures their entire life around your shared priorities, How do you process the reality that love can inspire such profound transformation? The most beautiful surprise came when Alexander showed Amara the nursery he designed with help from both their mothers, a space that combined his resources with her aesthetic sensibilities and included family photos that honored both their backgrounds. Alexander, Amara said, studying a wall that displayed pictures of his mother, her grandmother, and family recipes that had been framed like artwork, "This is our history." "This is our children's heritage," Alexander corrected. "I want Sophia and Marcus to grow up understanding that they come from people who built something meaningful with their hands, their hearts, and their determination." 6 months later, Amara stood in the kitchen of Heritage, the restaurant she and Alexander had opened in a restored brownstone in Manhattan, watching their children sleep in portable cribs while she prepared for the evening service that would celebrate their first year in business. Heritage had become exactly what Amara had dreamed of, a restaurant that honored culinary traditions while creating innovative experiences, that provided opportunities for young chefs while building a sustainable business, and that reflected her values while achieving the kind of success that validated her professional expertise. But more than that, Heritage had become a symbol of what was possible when two people chose to build something together rather than competing for individual achievement. "The Times Review came in," Alexander said, approaching Amara with their tablet and an expression of proud excitement. Amara read the 4-star review that praised Heritage as a restaurant that proves culinary excellence and social consciousness can thrive together, noting particularly the restaurant's commitment to training programs for disadvantaged youth and its innovative profit-sharing model that made every employee a stakeholder in its success. "We did it," Amara said, looking around the kitchen where she was working alongside young chefs who were learning not just culinary techniques but business principles that would help them build their own successful careers. "You did it," Alexander corrected. "This is your vision, your leadership, your success. I just provided support and investment." But Amara knew the truth was more complex and more beautiful than Alexander's modest assessment. Heritage existed because they had learned to combine their individual strengths into shared success, because they had discovered that love could be a creative force rather than a limitation on ambition. The evening service was perfect, a celebration dinner for their first anniversary that brought together investors, food critics, regular customers, and the extended family that had supported their journey from separated lovers to united partners. "Ladies and gentlemen," Alexander said, addressing the assembled guests as the evening wound down, "a year ago, Amara and I learned that the best business partnerships, like the best marriages, are built on mutual respect, shared vision, and the willingness to support each other's highest aspirations." He looked at Amara, who was holding Sophia while Marcus slept peacefully in his father's arms. "Tonight, we're celebrating more than a successful restaurant," Alexander continued. "We're celebrating the discovery that when two people truly commit to each other's dreams, those dreams become bigger and more meaningful than either person could have achieved alone." As their guests raised their glasses in a toast to Heritage, to their marriage, and to the family they'd built together, Amara reflected on how completely her life had been transformed by choosing love over fear, partnership over independence, and truth over the kind of pride that had once kept her from sharing her deepest needs and hopes. 1 year later, Heritage earned its first James Beard Award nomination, Sophia and Marcus took their first steps in the restaurant's private dining room, and Alexander published a business book about sustainable leadership that became a bestseller among entrepreneurs who wanted to build companies that served their communities rather than just generating profits. But the most meaningful achievement was something that couldn't be measured in awards or recognition. Amara and Alexander had created a life where success was defined not by individual accomplishment, but by the love and support they provided for each other and their children. The woman who had once hidden her pregnancy because she feared becoming a burden had become a chef whose restaurant employed dozens of people, and whose success created opportunities for others to achieve their own dreams. The man who had once believed that business success required sacrificing personal relationships had discovered that his greatest achievements came from using his resources to support his family's happiness and his community's well-being. Sometimes the most profound transformation comes not from changing who you are, but from learning to be who you truly are with someone who loves every aspect of your authentic self. Sometimes the greatest power couple isn't one where both people achieve individual success, but one where both people's success makes the other's dreams possible. And sometimes, when you think you're protecting someone from the burden of loving you, you're actually depriving both of you of the joy that comes from building something beautiful together. Amara and Alexander had learned that true partnership means supporting each other's growth, celebrating each other's achievements, and raising children who understand that love is not a limitation on ambition. It's the foundation that makes all meaningful ambition possible. Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.